The chamber was enormous, carved from a single asteroid that had been hollowed out over centuries. 73 different species sat in their designated sections, each area modified to suit their specific needs. Some breathed methane, others required water tanks, and a few existed as pure energy contained within crystalline structures. This was the Galactic Council, the governing body that had maintained peace across known space for over 10,000 years. Captain Ho stood in the human delegation area, his dress uniform feeling too tight around his collar. He had fought in 3 wars before humanity ever reached the stars, and he had commanded ships in the chaotic years after first contact. Nothing in his 40 years of service had prepared him for this moment. Beside him, Ambassador looked pale but composed, her hands clasped behind her back to hide their trembling. The Speaker of the Council, a creature called, rose from the central platform. It was tall and thin, with 4 arms and a head that resembled a praying mantis. Its compound eyes reflected the light from 1,000 different angles, making it impossible to tell where it was looking. When it spoke, the translation devices implanted in every delegate's ear converted the clicking sounds into understandable language. "The Council has reached its decision regarding the human question," announced. Its voice was cold and mechanical through the translator. "After extensive deliberation and review of all evidence presented over the past 3 standard years, the verdict is unanimous." Ho felt his stomach drop. Unanimous was never good. In a council of 73 species, unanimous meant something terrible. "Humanity is hereby declared incompatible with civilized galactic society," continued. "The charges are as follows: excessive capacity for violence, refusal to submit to mandatory neural pacification protocols, aggressive territorial expansion beyond designated zones, and maintaining military forces far exceeding peaceful exploration requirements." Ambassador stepped forward. "Speaker, we have explained our reasons for each of these points. Humanity evolved on a dangerous world. Our capacity for violence is a survival trait, not a character flaw. We cannot accept neural pacification because it would fundamentally alter what we are. Our expansion has been within the guidelines established during first contact, and our military exists because we have enemies who—" "Silence!" His command cut through the chamber like a blade. "The Council is not interested in excuses. Every species believes their circumstances are unique. Every species believes their violence is justified. This is precisely why the Council exists, to prevent such thinking from spreading." Another delegate stood, a massive creature covered in rocky plates. It spoke in deep, rumbling tones. "Humanity has been at war for 97% of its recorded history. You fight each other when you have no external enemies. You create weapons capable of destroying your own planet. You refuse to evolve beyond your violent nature." Ho wanted to shout that humans had also created art and music and literature, that they had built cities and explored their oceans and reached for the stars. That violence was only one aspect of what they were, but he knew it would not matter. The Council had already decided. Raised one of its 4 arms. "The sentence is exile. Humanity will remove itself from all colonized worlds within 1 standard galactic year. You will relocate beyond the frontier veil, to the region known as the Dead Zone. Any human vessel found in Council space after the deadline will be destroyed without warning or trial." The Dead Zone. Ho had heard stories about that region of space. It was surrounded by quantum storms and gravitational anomalies that made navigation nearly impossible. Entire fleets had vanished trying to explore it. The Council considered it worthless, too dangerous and resource-poor to bother with. It was perfect for a prison. "You cannot do this," Ambassador said, and now her voice shook with barely controlled anger. "We have 47 colony worlds, over 8 billion people living in space. The infrastructure required to move everyone in a single year is—" "That is humanity's problem to solve," interrupted. The Council will provide safe passage through our territories for your evacuation fleet, but nothing more. We suggest you begin immediately. The deadline is absolute." The chamber erupted in a cacophony of sounds as the various species expressed their agreement, or, in a few cases, their discomfort with the decision. Ho noticed that the delegation, an aquatic species housed in massive water tanks, had not joined the chorus of approval. Neither had but they were minorities, small voices in a council that had already made up its collective mind. Ambassador turned away from the platform, her face flushed with rage and humiliation. "We need to contact Earth immediately," she said to Ho. "The President needs to know." "Admiral already knows," Ho replied quietly. "I sent him a coded message the moment started speaking. He's probably already mobilizing the fleet." "To do what? Fight them? We're one species against 73. They'll wipe us out." "No," Ho said. "To buy us time, to protect the evacuation. That's all we can do now." As they left the chamber, Ho looked back one last time. The delegates were already moving on to other business, discussing trade agreements and border disputes as if they had not just condemned billions of people to exile. To them, humanity was simply a problem that had been solved, a dangerous element removed from the galactic equation. In the corridor outside, a delegate approached them. It moved slowly in its floating water sphere, propelled by some technology Ho did not understand. When it spoke, its voice was sad. "We voted against this," they said. "We argued for more time for rehabilitation programs for anything other than exile. We were outvoted." "Thank you for trying," Ambassador replied. "We will help however we can," they continued. "Our territory borders one of the safe routes to the dead zone. You will have safe passage through our space, and we will provide supplies and repair facilities. It is not much, but it is what we can offer." After they left, Ho and walked in silence back to their ship. The Perseverance was a small diplomatic vessel, unarmed and unarmored, designed to show humanity's peaceful intentions. That plan had clearly failed. "What do you think happens now?" asked as they approached the airlock. Ho thought about the 8 billion people who would need to be moved, the massive ships that would need to be built, the panic and chaos that would spread when the news became public. He thought about Admiral and the Third Fleet, about the young pilots who would have to hold the line while the civilians evacuated. He thought about the dead zone, that mysterious and dangerous region of space that would become humanity's new home. "Now," he said, "now we find out what humanity is really made of. We've been exiled before throughout our history. We've been cast out and pushed to the margins. We've survived ice ages and plagues and wars that nearly destroyed us. This is just one more challenge. And if we can't survive it..." Ho smiled grimly. "Then at least the galaxy won't have to worry about humanity anymore. But I don't think that's going to happen. I think we're going to surprise them. We always do." As the Perseverance undocked from the ring station and turned toward Earth, Ho watched the station shrink somewhere in that massive structure, 73 species were celebrating the removal of a threat. They thought they had solved their problem. They had no idea what they had just created. The news hit Earth like a shockwave. Within hours of Ambassador's broadcast, every major city erupted in protests. People gathered in the streets demanding answers, demanding action, demanding that their leaders do something to prevent the exile. But there was nothing to be done. The Galactic Council's decision was final, and humanity lacked the military strength to fight 73 species at once. Engineer Minu sat in his office at the orbital shipyard above Mars, staring at blueprints that suddenly seemed inadequate. He had been designing colony ships for peaceful expansion, vessels meant to carry a few thousand people in comfort over decades-long journeys. Now he needed to design arc ships capable of carrying millions in a single year. The mathematics alone were staggering. "It's impossible," his assistant said, looking at the numbers Minu had scrawled across his display. "We don't have the resources or the time. Even if we started building today and never stopped, we couldn't evacuate everyone in a year. Then we'll have to try the impossible, Minyu replied. He began redrawing the schematics, stripping away everything that was not essential. No luxury quarters, no observation decks, no artificial gravity in most sections. Just the bare minimum needed to keep people alive during the journey. Get me everyone from the engineering departments. I don't care if they're on vacation or retired. We need every brilliant mind we have. Across human space, similar scenes played out. Governor stood on the observation deck of Harmony Station, humanity's largest orbital city, watching construction crews begin the dismantling process. The station had taken 30 years to build, a marvel of engineering that housed 2 million people. Now it would be torn apart and its materials used to build evacuation ships. Everything humanity had built in space over 3 centuries would be sacrificed to save the people who lived there. The evacuation routes were carefully planned. There were 5 stable hyperspace lanes leading from human territory to the dead zone, and every ship would need to travel through one of them. The largest colony worlds began loading people onto anything that could fly. Cargo haulers, mining ships, pleasure yachts, and military vessels were all pressed into service as transports. Dr. who had spent her career studying alien cultures, found herself organizing refugee camps on Earth. Millions of colonists were being evacuated back to humanities before being sent to the dead zone. The infrastructure could not handle the sudden population increase. Food shortages and riots became daily occurrences. But not everyone was an enemy. The true to their word opened their territory to human ships. They provided fuel, food, and medical supplies at their border stations. They also helped, though more quietly, sending unmarked supply ships that docked with human vessels in deep space. These acts of kindness gave hope to people who desperately needed it. However, others saw opportunity in humanity's weakness. Pirate clans from the lawless outer regions began attacking the slower evacuation ships. They took captives to sell as slaves and stripped vessels of anything valuable. The desperate refugees could not defend themselves effectively. Lieutenant sat in the cockpit of her, listening to the distress call from a civilian transport. Her squadron had been assigned to escort duty, protecting the evacuation convoys from pirates and raiders. She had been a fighter pilot for 6 years, but she had never imagined she would be defending refugee ships from aliens who were supposed to be civilized. "Alpha Squadron, engage," she commanded, pushing her fighter toward the pirate vessels. The battle was brief but brutal. The pirates were experienced fighters, and her pilots were defending their people, their families, their future. They fought with a desperation that the pirates could not match. After the battle, fighter drifted alongside the damaged transport while repair crews worked. She could see faces in the windows, children and elderly people who had almost been taken. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her. How many more convoys would she need to protect? How many more battles would she fight before they reached safety? The Dominion made things worse. This militant species had been the loudest voice calling for humanity's exile, and now their warships shadowed the human convoys, waiting for any excuse to attack. They claimed they were ensuring humans actually left Council space, but everyone knew they were hopping for an incident that would justify violence. Admiral commanded the Third Fleet from his flagship, the Indomitable. His orders were clear: protect the evacuation at all costs, but do not fire first. The galaxy was looking for any excuse to call humans barbaric and violent. He could not give them that excuse, no matter how much he wanted to blast the ships out of space. As the convoys pushed deeper toward the dead zone, strange things began appearing on sensors. Ancient debris fields, thousands of years old, containing ships from civilizations no one in the Council had ever heard of. The wrecks were massive, some the size of small moons, and they all showed signs of incredible violence. Something had torn these ships apart. Lieutenant led a scout mission to investigate one of the derelict vessels. What her team found inside made her blood run cold. The ship's interior was scorched and twisted, as if enormous heat had melted the metal from the inside. There were no bodies, just strange residue that their scanners could not identify. Whatever had destroyed this ship had done so with such force that it had vaporized the crew. "Report this to Admiral immediately," ordered. "Something terrible happened here, and we're flying right into the middle of it." The deadline was approaching fast. With 3 months remaining, millions of people still needed to be evacuated. Governor sent a desperate message to Earth requesting more ships, but there were no more ships to send. Every vessel capable of flying was already in use. Engineer Minu stood in the construction bay, watching the last Ark ship being completed. He had designed 30 of these massive vessels, each capable of carrying 5 million people in cryogenic suspension. It was his greatest achievement and his worst nightmare. The ships were crude and barely tested, but they were the only hope for the millions who would not make it through the hyperspace lanes on conventional transports. Doctor worked 20-hour days organizing the evacuation camps, ensuring that families stayed together and that the most vulnerable received priority boarding. She saw the worst and best of humanity during those months. She saw people fighting over food, but she also saw strangers sharing their last rations with hungry children. She saw despair, but also hope. Humanity was being tested, and despite everything, they were passing that test. With 1 week remaining before the deadline, Admiral received reports that thousands of ships would not make it in time. They were too slow, too damaged, or too far from the hyperspace lanes. He faced an impossible choice: abandon them to their fate or stay and fight to buy them more time. He called his senior officers to a meeting aboard the Indomitable. Around the table sat men and women who had served with him for decades, people he trusted with his life. He laid out the situation honestly. "If we stay, we'll be fighting the entire Council fleet," he said. "We cannot win, but we can buy those ships enough time to reach the dead zone. The question is whether we have the right to make that choice for everyone in this fleet." The answer came unanimously. They would stay. Every officer volunteered to remain behind and hold the line. When Admiral asked for volunteers from the rest of the fleet, over 60% of his ships chose to stay and fight. Lieutenant stood on the flight deck of her carrier, watching the civilian ships pass by on their way to safety. Her squadron would be part of the rear guard, one of the last units to withdraw. She thought about her family, already safe in the dead zone, and she thought about the people she was protecting. If this was her last flight, at least it would be for something that mattered. As the deadline expired, the Council fleet arrived at the border of human space. They were massive and powerful, ships designed to enforce peace across the entire galaxy. Admiral's Third Fleet positioned itself between the Council armada and the fleeing refugees. The Council commander sent a message: "You are in violation of the Exile order. Withdraw immediately or be destroyed." Admiral responded, "We are protecting civilians who are complying with your order. When the last ship crosses into the dead zone, we will follow. Until then, we hold this position." The standoff lasted for 18 hours while the final refugee ships crawled toward safety. The Council fleet could have destroyed the Third Fleet easily, but doing so would mean firing on ships that were clearly trying to comply with the Exile order. It would make the Council look cruel and unjust. Finally, the last civilian transport crossed into the dead zone. Admiral gave the order to withdraw. The Third Fleet turned and followed their people into exile, leaving Council space behind forever. As the Indomitable crossed into the quantum storm surrounding the dead zone, Admiral looked back at the stars they were leaving behind. Humanity had been cast out, forced from their homes and colonies, exiled to a dangerous region of space that no one else wanted. But they had survived. Against impossible odds, they had evacuated billions of people and reached their new home. Now came the hard part: building a civilization in the darkness. 20 years had passed since humanity entered the dead zone. An entire generation had grown up knowing only the harsh reality of exile. children who had never seen Earth except in old recordings and history lessons. The dead zone was their home now, a cluster of star systems wrapped in radiation storms and gravitational anomalies that made every journey dangerous. Director Sara stood on the observation platform of New Haven, humanity's largest settlement in the dead zone. The city was built inside a hollowed asteroid, its interior carved out and transformed into a livable space for 3 million people. It was not beautiful like the old orbital cities had been, but it was functional, and more importantly, it was home. Another supply shipment just arrived from the colony, her assistant reported. Captain says the route through the quantum storm is getting more unstable. We might need to find an alternate path. Sara nodded, making a note on her. Captain was one of the most experienced navigators in the dead zone, a merchant captain who ran supplies between the scattered human settlements. If he said a route was becoming dangerous, she believed him. Navigation in the dead zone required constant adaptation. The quantum storms shifted unpredictably, opening and closing passages through space in patterns that seemed random. But humanity had learned to read those patterns. Commander and his team at the Perimeter Guard had spent 2 decades mapping the storms, creating a constantly updated database of safe routes. It gave humanity an advantage. They could travel through the dead zone with relative safety, while any outsider attempting to enter would almost certainly be lost in the storms. The dead zone had 47 star systems, spread across a region of space larger than the old human territory. 30 of those systems had habitable worlds or useful resources. Humanity had established settlements on 18 of them, building underground cities and orbital stations, creating a network of colonies connected by the dangerous but navigable storm passages. Life was hard, resources were limited, and every settlement had to be self-sufficient because supply lines could be cut off for months if the storms shifted badly. But humanity adapted. They always did. They built farms under artificial lights, mined asteroids for raw materials, and developed new technologies to survive in their hostile environment. Researcher worked in a laboratory carved into the surface of an airless moon. She was part of a team studying the ancient ruins that were scattered throughout the dead zone. Every system they explored contained evidence of a previous civilization, structures millions of years old that showed signs of advanced technology. The ruins were fascinating and deeply disturbing. "Look at this," said to her colleague, projecting a hologram of an alien structure they had discovered. "The metallurgy is incredibly advanced, beyond anything we can produce. But look at these scorch marks. Whatever destroyed this facility did so with such heat that it melted solid metal like wax." Her colleague studied the image carefully. "This is the 3rd site we have found with similar damage. All of them show signs of the same kind of destruction. It happened at the same time, approximately 3 million years ago." Had been piecing together a theory, one that frightened her more with each new discovery. The previous inhabitants of the dead zone had not destroyed themselves in a civil war. They had been exterminated by something else, something that came from outside. She had found fragments of text in the ruins, written in a dozen different alien languages, all saying variations of the same warning. They are coming. They cannot be reasoned with. They cannot be stopped. She brought her findings to Director Sara, who listened with growing concern. If was right, the dead zone was not just a prison. It was a graveyard, the final resting place of civilizations that had tried to hide from something terrible. Commander commanded the Perimeter Guard from a network of sensor stations positioned at the edges of the dead zone. His job was to monitor the quantum barriers and watch for any threats. It was usually boring work, watching sensors display the same readings day after day. But 3 months ago, something had changed. His sensors had detected movement in dark space, the vast empty region beyond the galactic rim where there should be nothing at all. The objects were massive, each one the size of a moon, and they were moving with purpose. The trajectories suggested intelligence, a deliberate course toward the galaxy. had sent his data to every analyst he trusted, hoping someone would tell him he was wrong. But the analysis came back consistent. Something was coming from dark space, multiple objects traveling at sublight speed. At their current velocity, they would reach Council space in approximately 5 years. He called an emergency meeting with Director Sora and showed her the data. They sat in his office, watching the sensor readings play across the holographic display, and neither spoke for a long time. "Are you certain?" Sora finally asked. "As certain as I can be. The readings are consistent across all our perimeter stations. Whatever these things are, they're real and they're heading for the galaxy." Sora thought about researchers' warnings, about the ancient civilizations that had been wiped out, about the ruins that covered the dead zone like tombstones. She thought about humanity, exiled and forgotten, sitting in the path of whatever was coming. "We need to warn the Council," she said. Looked at her in surprise. "They exiled us. They made it clear that any human ship entering Council space would be destroyed. Why should we warn them?" "Because it's the right thing to do," Sora replied. "Because millions of innocent people will die if we don't. Because we're better than they think we are." The debate raged for weeks among humanity's leadership. Some argued that they should remain silent and let the galaxy that had exiled them face the threat unprepared. Others said that humanity should focus on defending their own people and let the Council deal with their own problems. But in the end, the decision came down to a simple question. What kind of species did humanity want to be? Director Sora recorded a message to send to the Galactic Council. It contained all of researchers' findings, every piece of data from Commander's sensors, and a clear warning. Something is coming that makes humanity's capacity for violence look insignificant. She transmitted the message through every channel she could access, ensuring that it would reach the Council even if they tried to ignore it. The response came 3 weeks later. It was brief and dismissive. The Council refused to acknowledge the warning as legitimate. They classified it as a desperate attempt by humanity to end their exile, a fabrication designed to trick the Council into allowing humans back into civilized space. Counselor himself appeared in a public broadcast, stating that humanity's claims were scientifically impossible and that they should focus on accepting their exile with dignity. In the dead zone, people watched the broadcast with anger and resignation. They had tried to do the right thing, and the galaxy had rejected their warning. Now they would have to prepare alone. Admiral, who had taken command of humanity's combined military after Admiral's retirement, began organizing the fleet. Every ship was pulled from other duties and assigned to defense positions. Engineers worked around the clock to upgrade weapons and shields. Training exercises became more intense and frequent. General commanded the ground forces, preparing for the possibility that whatever was coming might try to invade human settlements. He organized every colony's defense force, established supply caches, and created evacuation plans. His soldiers trained for a war they did not understand, against an enemy they had never seen. But humanity had allies. They sent a secret delegation to the dead zone, traveling through the dangerous quantum storms with human guides. They listened to the evidence and believed it. They also sent representatives. Together, these 3 species represented a tiny fraction of the galaxy's military power, but they were united by a common understanding. Something terrible was coming, and the Council was too arrogant to see it. 6 months later, the first attack came. A frontier colony on the edge of Council space stopped transmitting. Council ships were sent to investigate, and what they found changed everything. The colony was gone, completely destroyed. Buildings were reduced to rubble, and there were no survivors. But there was a recording made by the colony's defense systems in the final moments before everything went dark. The recording showed creatures that were half biological and half mechanical, ships that seemed alive, pulsing with organic matter fused to metal and crystal. They descended on the colony like locusts, harvesting every living thing, breaking down organic matter into raw materials. The colonists had tried to defend themselves, but their weapons barely scratched the invaders. In less than 3 hours, a colony of 2 million people simply ceased to exist. The council watched the recording in horror. These were the harvesters, the creatures that the ancient warnings had spoken of. They were not interested in communication or negotiation. They simply consumed everything organic in their path and used it to create more of themselves. Counselor stood before the council chamber, older now and visibly shaken. The chamber was silent as the recording played again for all the delegates to see. When it finished, spoke in a voice that had lost its usual confidence. Humanity warned us. We did not listen. We dismissed their evidence as lies and fabrications. We were wrong. The council mobilized its fleet, the most powerful military force in the galaxy. Thousands of ships assembled at the frontier, preparing to face the harvester threat. The galaxy watched and waited, believing that their mighty fleet would easily handle whatever was coming. They had no idea how wrong they were. The harvester swarm hit the council fleet like a tidal wave of living metal and flesh. The first battle took place in the Outer Rim, where 3,000 council warships had assembled to face the threat. The council's military commanders had studied the recordings from the destroyed colony and believed they understood what they were fighting. They were wrong. The harvester ships moved in patterns that seemed chaotic but were actually carefully coordinated. They attacked in waves, using their own destroyed units as shields while the next wave pressed forward. Council weapons that should have destroyed them outright merely damaged them, and the harvesters adapted quickly. Ships that survived one type of weapon attack became resistant to it on their next approach. The battle lasted 6 hours. When it ended, the council fleet had lost 40% of its ships and was retreating in complete disorder. The harvesters pursued, harvesting the wreckage and the dead, using everything to create more of themselves. They were not just an army, they were a growing infestation. Ambassador, daughter of the late ambassador, watched the news broadcasts in horror from her quarters in New Haven. She was 32 years old, born during the Exodus, and she had grown up hearing stories about the galaxy her mother had tried so hard to join. Now that galaxy was dying, and the council still refused to ask humanity for help. 15 more colonies fell in the following weeks. Each time, the pattern was the same. The harvesters would arrive, overwhelm the defenses, and harvest every living thing before moving to the next target. The council fleet engaged them in 3 more major battles and lost each time. The harvesters were learning faster than the council could adapt. Director Sora sent another message to the council, this one more direct. "You are losing this war. You need help. We are willing to provide it. Please respond." For 3 days, there was no answer. The council's pride would not allow them to admit they needed assistance from the species they had exiled. Then Counselor appeared on every human communication channel. The old looked exhausted, its movements slower than remembered. When it spoke, there was no arrogance left in its voice. "I am authorized by the Galactic Council to formally request military assistance from humanity. The Exile order is temporarily suspended. We need your help." Director Sora did not hesitate. She responded immediately, "Tell us where you need us." Admiral gave the order, and the human fleet emerged from the dead zone like ghosts returning to haunt the living. The council ships that detected them first could not believe what they were seeing. Humanity's fleet had grown, and more importantly, it had changed. These were not exploration vessels or civilian transports. These were warships, pure and simple, designed and built over 20 years of exile with one purpose: to fight and survive. The human ships were ugly compared to the sleek council vessels. They were angular and brutal, covered in armor plating and bristling with weapons. Every system was redundant, every weak point reinforced. They looked like they had been designed by people who expected to be hit and wanted to make sure they could take the punishment. Captain commanded the Spite, a retrofitted colony vessel that had been transformed into something the Council's military computers could not properly classify. It was too large to be a destroyer, too heavily armed to be a transport, and too fast to be a dreadnought. It was a mongrel ship, built from scavenged parts and desperation, and it was beautiful in its ugliness. The human fleet joined the Council forces at the defense of the Nexus system, a major population center with over 20 billion inhabitants spread across 6 planets. Intelligence indicated that the Harvesters were heading there in force. It would be the largest battle of the war. Commander coordinated with Council military planners, sharing everything humanity had learned about the Harvesters from studying the ancient warnings and analyzing the battle data. He noticed something that the Council's computers had missed. The Harvesters moved in predictable patterns because they were networked together, sharing information instantaneously across their entire swarm. "They're like a hive mind," explained to a room full of skeptical Council officers. "Each ship is connected to all the others. That makes them incredibly coordinated, but it also gives them a weakness. If we can disrupt that network even temporarily, they'll become disorganized." "How do we disrupt it?" a Council admiral asked. "With a quantum pulse. If we trigger enough quantum drives simultaneously, the gravimetric shockwave should interfere with their communication. That would require ships to be completely surrounded by the enemy," the admiral said. "No crew would survive." "Then we'll use volunteer crews," replied. "We're good at suicide missions. We've had 20 years to practice." The Battle of the Nexus began when the Harvester fleet entered the system. There were thousands of them, more than had been seen in any previous engagement. The Council fleet moved to intercept, with the human ships forming the forward elements. The tactical computers declared the battle unwinnable within the first hour. Admiral stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Defiance, watching the tactical display. The Harvesters were pressing forward in their usual wave pattern, absorbing losses and learning from each exchange. The Council fleet was fighting well, but they were being pushed back. The Nexus system's inner planets would be exposed within hours at this rate. He activated the fleet-wide communication channel. "All human ships, execute Protocol Desperate Gambit. I repeat, execute Desperate Gambit." The Council officers who heard this transmission were confused. The human ships suddenly changed formation, pushing deeper into the Harvester fleet instead of falling back. They allowed themselves to be surrounded, something every military doctrine said was suicide. The Harvesters swarmed around them like predators sensing an easy kill. Captain watched his tactical display as the Spite pushed into the heart of the Harvester formation. His crew was silent, everyone focused on their tasks, knowing what was coming. They had volunteered for this mission, every single person aboard. They knew they probably would not survive, but they also knew their sacrifice would matter. "All ships report ready," his weapons officer said. "Opened a channel to Admiral, Spite Actual, we're in position, ready to initiate on your command." All across the battlefield, 73 human ships reported the same thing. They were surrounded, their quantum drives charged and ready. The Council fleet had pulled back to a safe distance, waiting for something they did not understand. "All ships," Admiral commanded, "initiate quantum pulse. It's been an honor serving with you." 73 ships triggered their quantum drives simultaneously while surrounded by the Harvester fleet. The result was a massive gravimetric shockwave that rippled through space, distorting reality itself for several seconds. The Harvester network collapsed, their hive connection severed. For the first time since the war began, the Harvesters became disorganized, each ship acting independently without coordination. Captain felt the Spite shaking apart around him as the quantum pulse tore through its hull. His last thought was that his daughter would be proud of what he had done. The Spite exploded in a brilliant flash, taking 3 Harvester ships with it. The Council fleet charged forward into the chaos. Without their network coordination, the Harvesters were still dangerous but no longer unbeatable. The Council's heavy weapons could target individual ships effectively. The battle turned into a brutal slugging match, ship against ship, and slowly the Council began to win. Ambassador watched the battle reports from the Defiance's observation deck. She saw the names of the ships that had sacrificed themselves, reading each one aloud like a prayer. 73 ships, over 40,000 people, gone in an instant to give the galaxy a chance to survive. The Battle of the Nexus lasted 3 days. When it ended, the Harvester fleet had been destroyed, and the Nexus system was saved. But the cost was terrible. The Council had lost 30% of its remaining fleet, and humanity had lost those 73 ships in the Quantum Pulse, plus another 100 in the conventional fighting that followed. General arrived with ground forces to help secure the Nexus system's planets. His soldiers found Harvester remains scattered across 2 of the worlds, evidence that some of the creatures had made it to the surface before being destroyed. They also found something else: Harvester eggs, thousands of them, buried in the ground. The creatures had been trying to establish breeding colonies. The war was not over. This was just one battle, and there were more Harvesters coming. But the Council had learned something important. They could be beaten. The Harvesters were not invincible. They could be disrupted, outsmarted, and destroyed. It just required tactics that the Council had never considered, tactics born from desperation and survival instinct. Counselor sent a personal message to Director Sara. It was brief and to the point. "Thank you. We were wrong about your species. Can you forgive us?" Sara read the message 3 times before responding. "We'll talk about forgiveness after we win this war. Right now, we have work to do." The galaxy had learned that humanity's capacity for violence was not a flaw. It was a survival trait, honed over millions of years on a world that tried to kill them every day. And now that trait might be the only thing that could save everyone. The war continued for 3 more years. It was brutal and costly, but the momentum had shifted. The Council species learned to fight like humanity taught them, with controlled aggression and tactical flexibility. They learned to accept casualties when necessary, to take risks, and to use the Harvesters' predictable patterns against them. Most importantly, they learned not to fear their own capacity for violence. Admiral commanded the combined fleet, a massive armada that included ships from 40 different species. The human vessels still formed the vanguard, the first units to engage in every battle, but now they were supported by Council ships that had adopted similar tactics. They proved surprisingly adept at ambush warfare, using their aquatic physiology to think in 3 dimensions better than most species. They developed kamikaze drones based on humanity's quantum pulse tactic. The Harvesters adapted too. They became more cautious, sending scout units ahead and varying their attack patterns. But they were limited by their networked intelligence. They could only learn as fast as their organic processors allowed, while the galaxy's defenders were driven by desperation and imagination. Commander spent his days analyzing Harvester movements, looking for patterns and weaknesses. He discovered that the Harvesters had a central hub, a massive structure deep in dark space that coordinated all their operations. If that hub could be destroyed, the entire Harvester fleet would become disorganized. The problem was that the hub was located in a region of space so hostile that no ship had ever survived traveling there. General led the ground defense of 17 major worlds that the Harvesters targeted. His soldiers learned to fight the Harvesters in close combat, using explosives and fire to destroy the organic components that held the creatures together. It was terrifying work, fighting creatures that would not stop until they were completely destroyed, but human soldiers had experience fighting in hell. They trained the Council's ground forces, teaching them urban combat and guerrilla warfare tactics that had been developed during Earth's countless wars. The turning point came when researcher made a discovery in the ancient ruins. She found a complete data archive from the civilization that had previously inhabited the dead zone. The archive contained detailed information about the Harvesters, including their life cycle, their weaknesses, and most importantly, the location of their breeding grounds. The harvesters reproduced slowly, creating new units from harvested organic matter. But they needed specific conditions to create their core processors, the organic brains that controlled each unit. Those processors were grown in nursery ships, massive vessels that took years to mature a single batch of new harvesters. Destroy the nursery ships, and the harvesters could not replace their losses. Director Sora brought this information to a meeting of the Council's military leadership. Around the table sat admirals and generals from dozens of species, all looking exhausted but determined. She presented findings, showing them scans of the nursery ships and their locations. "We can win this war," Sora said, "but it will require a coordinated strike on every nursery ship simultaneously. We'll need to divide our forces and attack targets across 3 sectors of space at once." A council admiral, a reptilian creature named Thresh, shook his head. "That's too risky. If even one strike fails, the harvesters will adapt and move their remaining nurseries. We'll lose our only chance." "Then we make sure every strike succeeds," Admiral said. "We've been fighting defensively for 3 years. It's time to take the offensive." The operation was named Final Harvest. Every available ship was assigned to one of 15 strike groups, each targeting a nursery ship. The attacks would happen simultaneously, leaving the harvesters no time to respond. It was the most ambitious military operation in galactic history. Ambassador volunteered to accompany the strike force targeting the largest nursery ship. She was not a soldier, but she wanted to be there when humanity finally struck back against the creatures that had nearly destroyed the galaxy. Admiral tried to talk her out of it, but she was as stubborn as her mother had been. The strike groups launched from their staging areas on the same day. They traveled through hyperspace along carefully planned routes, timing their arrival for maximum effect. The harvesters detected the approaching fleets but could not determine which targets were real threats and which were decoys. Captain commanded the battleship Retribution, flagship of Strike Group 7. His target was a nursery ship hidden in a nebula, protected by 300 harvester defenders. His force consisted of 60 ships, a mix of human destroyers and council cruisers. The odds were not favorable. "All ships, weapons-free," commanded as they dropped out of hyperspace. "Target the nursery ship. Ignore everything else unless they get in your way." The battle was chaos. Harvester defenders threw themselves at the attacking fleet with desperate ferocity, but Strike Group 7 pushed forward relentlessly. Ships were destroyed on both sides, but the attackers maintained their focus. The nursery ship was enormous, 3 times larger than any council dreadnought and heavily armored. Ordered his ships to concentrate fire on a single point, punching through the armor with sustained bombardment. When the breach opened, he sent boarding parties inside. Human marines and council soldiers fought side by side through the nursery ship's corridors, destroying the immature processors before they could be evacuated. Across the galaxy, similar battles played out. 13 of the 15 strike groups succeeded in destroying their targets. 2 groups were overwhelmed by harvester defenders and forced to retreat, but the operation was still a success. The harvesters' ability to replace losses had been crippled. The harvesters responded with a massive counterattack, throwing everything they had at Earth. Intelligence suggested they had identified humanities as the key to the galaxy's resistance. If they could destroy Earth, they believed the will to fight would collapse. Director Sora stood in the command center of New Haven, watching the tactical displays as the harvester fleet approached Earth. Every human ship that could fly had been pulled back to defend there. The Council had sent reinforcements too, repaying humanity's sacrifice by standing with them in their darkest hour. The Battle of Earth lasted 4 days. The harvesters attacked in waves, each one larger than the last. The defense forces fought with everything they had, using every tactic they had learned over 3 years of war. The space around Earth became a graveyard of ships, both human and harvester. General commanded the ground defenses when harvester landing craft broke through the orbital lines. They landed in 17 locations across Earth's surface, and the fighting became brutal. Human soldiers fought in the streets of their cities, defending their homes with a ferocity that shocked even their allies. Every meter of ground cost the harvesters dearly. Ambassador coordinated the evacuation of civilians from combat zones while flying supplies to the front lines. She had never fired a weapon in anger before this war, but now she flew a transport ship through combat zones with calm efficiency. She was her mother's daughter, diplomatic when possible and fierce when necessary. On the fourth day of battle, Commander detected something on his sensors. The harvester fleet was pulling back. At first, he thought it was a tactical withdrawal, but then he realized the truth. They were retreating. The harvesters had never retreated before. They were breaking off the attack and heading back toward dark space. The defense forces watched in exhausted amazement as the harvester ships turned and fled. They had won. Earth was saved. The cost was terrible: 3 billion people dead, entire cities destroyed, and scars that would take generations to heal, but they had survived. The war continued for another 6 months as the remaining harvesters were hunted down across the galaxy. Small pockets of resistance remained, but without their nursery ships and with their numbers depleted, the harvesters could not sustain their offensive. The last confirmed harvester ship was destroyed near the galactic rim, and the threat finally ended. The Galactic Council convened at Axis Prime, the same location where humanity had been exiled 23 years earlier. But this time, the human delegation walked into the chamber as heroes rather than criminals. Counselor stood at the central platform, older now and showing the strain of the war years. "We called you here to exile you," said, addressing Ambassador directly. "We told you that humanity was too dangerous to exist among civilized species. We were wrong, not about your capacity for violence. That is exactly as we feared, but we were wrong about what that capacity means." Gestured to the assembled delegates. "Every species here survived because humanity taught us that violence is not evil. It is simply a tool, and like any tool, it can be used for good or ill. You taught us to fight, and in doing so, you saved us all." The Council voted unanimously to expunge humanity's exile from all records. They offered humanity full Council membership with a permanent seat in the High Chamber. More than that, they offered respect and gratitude. Admiral attended the ceremony but did not speak. When it ended, he returned to the dead zone with Commander. They had both earned retirement, and they chose to spend it together on a quiet colony world, trying to forget the war and build something peaceful with their remaining years. Director Sora became the first human High Counselor. She worked to ensure that no species would ever be judged as harshly as humanity had been, that the galaxy would remain united against future threats. She established the Joint Defense Initiative, a permanent military alliance that included all Council species. The Dead Zone remained humanity's territory by universal agreement, but it was no longer a prison. It became the galaxy's premier military academy, where soldiers from every species came to learn the lessons that humanity had paid for in blood. They learned tactics and strategy, but more importantly, they learned about courage and sacrifice. General retired and wrote a book about the war. It became required reading at every military school in the galaxy. The book's final chapter addressed the question everyone wanted to ask: would humanity have warned the Council if they had known how the war would turn out? His answer was simple: yes, because that's who we are. We fight when we must, but we also protect those who cannot protect themselves, even if they hate us. That is what makes us human. A monument was built on Earth, listing every ship and every person lost during the exile and the war. At its base, carved in stone, was a simple message: we were cast out for being dangerous. We returned because being dangerous was necessary. The galaxy learned what fear was during those terrible years. They learned what humanity could do when pushed to the edge, but they also learned what humanity would do when others needed help. They learned that violence and compassion were not opposites, that the same species capable of terrible destruction was also capable of impossible sacrifice. And somewhere in dark space, far beyond the galactic rim, the surviving harvesters remembered their defeat. They remembered the species that had broken their invasion, the humans who fought with controlled fury and tactical brilliance. They remembered, and they chose not to return. The galaxy was forever changed by the war. Species that had lived in peace for thousands of years now maintained standing militaries. The Council's priorities shifted from exploration to defense. The age of innocence was over. But humanity thrived in this new reality. They had spent their entire history preparing for threats that other species could not imagine. Now they helped those species prepare too. They taught, they trained, and they protected. The dangerous species that had been exiled became the guardian species that the galaxy depended on. 20 years after the war ended, a new generation of council members asked Counselor why the council had been so afraid of humanity. Ancient now and near the end of its life, gave an answer that had become famous across the galaxy. We were afraid because humanity embraced both darkness and light. They understood violence but were not ruled by it. They could be peaceful but were never helpless. We feared them because they were complete, while we had only learned half of what it means to survive. They taught us the other half, and we should be grateful for that lesson, no matter how painful it was to learn. Humanity's exile had ended. Their redemption was complete, but they would never forget those years in the dead zone, never forget the sacrifice required to protect a galaxy that had rejected them. Those memories shaped everything they became, a reminder that being dangerous was not enough. You also had to be worthy of the power you possessed. And humanity, tested by fire and exile, had proven themselves worthy.